All right, welcome back to Use History lecture videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Today we're going to briefly cover bits of the political corruption and farmers' revolts lessons. So we're going to discuss the national political scene during the Gilded Age, analyze why many critics considered the Gilded Age a period of ineffectual national leadership, understand how the economic and political climate of the day promoted the formation of the farmers' protest movement, and explain how the farmers' revolt moved from protest to politics. So, what was the Gilded Age? The Gilded Age was actually named by Mark Twain in his 1873 novel, The Gilded Age: A Tale of Today. So it's considered this era in the second half of the 19th century, marked by rapid industrialization, but also corruption and inequality. The term gilded means covered thinly in gold, suggesting a shiny surface hiding problems underneath. Who composed the largest percentage of the population during this time? Believe it or not, the farmers. Not everybody realizes that. So, major challenges of this time period included Reconstruction and racial tensions after the Civil War, farmers who were facing mounting debts and falling crop prices, urban workers enduring harsh factory conditions and low wages, and this growing gap between the rich and the poor. So, you can just take a moment and consider which group do you think faced the greatest hardships during this period and why, right? Who was going through the roughest time? We see a lot of political corruption during this time as well. There was something that happened during this time period called the Bloody Shirt Campaign. And this essentially was a strategy of Republican candidates when competing against, wow, when competing against Democratic candidates. Essentially, it's political chaos. So Democrats had shown a spotlight on earlier Republican scandals when they were trying to win political elections. And Republicans basically retaliated by relying upon the Bloody Shirt campaign, which was a strategy of reminding the nation of the human toll of the Civil War um, against Southern Confederates who now reappeared in politics under the mantle of the Democratic Party. So many of the Democratic political leaders or those who were running for political office as Democrats had been a Southern Confederate. And the South, of course, lost the war. And so the opposing political party, the Republicans, was using any strategy that they could in order to get um, themselves into office. And so they were sort of happy to smear the Democrats and remind people, hey, the Democrats, they're responsible for the Civil War and everyone who died in that Civil War, and kind of using that bloody shirt tactic. All right, so political problems. Excuse me. Political problems during this time period. Presidents had very little real power. And so, even though a president was elected, they struggled to get anything done during this time period. Our textbook can go into more detail on as to why that is. Elections were won by razor thin margins, and so political parties were extremely divided during this time. And that made it hard for anybody to get anything done. Congress was dominated by political patronage, and there was widespread corruption at state and federal levels. So politicians often catered to business interests rather than the people that they were supposed to be representing. So corrupt politics. Political reform and an end to post-Civil War construction or Reconstruction was the main political goal of both parties in the election of 1876. So they were aware that things were messy, and both sides sort of had this in common: the goal of ending post-Civil War Reconstruction and to reform in the arena of politics. But you can just see, as an example, this election tells you exactly how close things were, right? The Republican candidate won by a single vote, a single electoral vote. So you can see how divided the country was during this time period. And so people began developing their own solutions when the government failed to help. Farmers organized into groups and formed new political parties. Workers formed labor movements, and these movements and others later led to the larger progressive era movements, which we'll talk about in a few more lessons. So ultimately, the Gilded Age was this period of dramatic growth, but marked by political corruption and social problems. And ultimately, all of these problems led to reform movements. that shaped and changed America. And we'll talk more about those movements in a different lesson. The second part of today's lesson is the rise of the farmers movement. So the farmers were in crisis during this time period, and they were the largest portion of the U.S. population. Um, they faced key challenges like declining crop prices, high tariffs on goods they needed, foreign competition, and overproduction of crops. So the cost of farming is at an all-time high, and the money you make farming is at an all-time low. Farmers were struggling. And understanding overproduction was tricky, right? Essentially, overproduction or producing more food than the country needed was a result of that incredible westward expansion we talked about a few lessons ago, and farmers going into debt as technology developed to purchase all of these farming pieces of equipment. Um, and then they would increase their production and expand their farms because they had the farming equipment and because they had to create more money to pay off the debt on the farming equipment. And that created a cycle. More crops than needed, which meant crops sold for lower prices, which meant more debt, which meant trying to grow more crops to help pay off this debt, which continued to flood the market with too many products. But this was tricky for some people to understand, and certainly even those who understood it felt like they couldn't do anything about it on a large scale. The other issues was that there were some currency issues going on, limited paper money in circulation, and there was this debate of gold money versus the silver standard. Um, and so the economy was not helping things. So this led to a couple of farmers' movements to try and make things better for themselves. The first major farmer organization was called Patrons of Husbandry, or the Grange, and was started in 1867 and eventually grew to 1.5 million members. Now, what it did is it created farmer cooperatives so that people could pool resources, get better shipping rates, and negotiate better prices on supplies. They were successful early on, and then Granger laws were ruled unconstitutional in 1886. So what they were trying to do was made illegal. And so that fell apart. And then in the 1880s, 3 regional groups were formed within the Farmers Alliance, so the Southwestern, the Northwest, and the Colored. The total membership for all 3 reached 2.5 million, and it was notable and acclaimed for including both black and white farmers and featured prominent roles for women. So again, trying to make things better by uniting people, negotiating better situations for themselves. One solution proposed by this alliance was presented to the government, and it said, what if you guys store crops temporarily, provide loans worth 80% of the crop value so farmers can afford to wait for better prices, and then they can repay the loans after selling at higher prices. So trying to counteract the flooding or overproduction of crops in the market. But the government said no. Perhaps they did not want to risk that amount of debt, right? And so, angry at the federal government's unwillingness to really do a lot to help the plight of the average farmer, the Farmers Alliance and Charles McCune chose to create a political party that could represent them and enact real change. So if the government wouldn't address the problem, then it was time to change those who were elected in the government. In 1891, the alliance formed the Populist Party, also known as the People's Party, and then began with non-presidential elections. It worked its way up, and they actually had some moderate success. They had state legislators, 1 governor, and a handful of congressmen elected. And then with the 1892 presidential election approaching, the populists chose to model themselves after the Democratic and Republican parties in the hope that they could shock the country with a third party victory. Their candidate, unfortunately, finished last. He finished at a distant third, but he did get 1 million votes, which was substantial. And rather than being disappointed, a lot of the populists were quite pleased, and they thought that was a very good beginning. So we'll talk more about how that goes as we move forward through time, but that is the end of today's lesson. So we'll kind of track the Populist Party as we move forward in time.